They humiliated him in front of everyone, said he was trespassing, said he didn't belong, and had security escort him off the property. All because he was a black man standing where they didn't think a black man should stand. He had a reservation, he had confirmation, he had every right to be there. But none of that mattered. Not to them. No questions asked, no explanations offered, just a quiet exile dressed up as protocol. What they didn't realize, what would shake the ground beneath them, was that the man they tried to erase wasn't just anybody, and erasing him came with a cost they never saw coming. If that opening hit you, if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit subscribe and stay with us. Let us know in the comments. The real story is just getting started. Marcus Bailey arrived at Lakemont Country Club with the confidence of a man who had everything in order. The mist clung to his jacket, and his steps were calm, unhurried, as he walked past the fountain toward the grand double doors. His tea time was 9:10, booked under the name of Carlton Henders, and confirmed by the club's own app just 20 minutes earlier. Inside, the air smelled of leather polish and lemon wood cleaner. He stepped up to the front desk, pulled out his ID and confirmation, and greeted the concierge. A pale young man in a burgundy blazer who barely looked up from the computer. Marcus explained the situation. Tea time. Guest of Henders. Paid. Confirmed. The concierge glanced at the screen for half a second before straightening his tie and shaking his head. Sorry, sir, we're at capacity this morning. A lot of last-minute adjustments. Looks like your group's already gone out. He said it quickly, like reading from a card. Marcus narrowed his eyes slightly. Carlton had not mentioned any changes. He double-checked his phone. No calls, no messages. Still, he remained composed. Could you confirm with someone inside? I've got the email right here, the concierge. I'm afraid the tea sheets are locked for today. If there's confusion, you may need to follow up later. Perhaps we can get you rescheduled sometime next week. Marcus looked past the desk. The lobby was full of men in quarter zips and Titleist caps. Two guests had just walked in, laughing loudly, one of them wearing jeans not even close to the dress code. They breezed past the desk, nodded at the concierge, and were let through without a glance at the system. Marcus turned back to the young man behind the counter. His ID was still untouched. No one had verified anything. He felt the tension gather in his shoulders. Not rage, not yet, but the quiet pressure of being dismissed without reason, without acknowledgement, without even the decency of a lie that tried harder. A moment later, a tall man with gray temples emerged from a side office. He was introduced as Bryce's services director. Bryce smiled like a lawyer at a press conference. Mr. Bailey, is it? Sorry about the confusion this morning. Looks like the timesheet's full, and the group you were linked with has already teed off. So, no room, even though I booked and paid. Bryce didn't flinch. Sometimes adjustments are made to accommodate our higher-tier members. It's just one of those mornings. I'm sure you understand. His voice was practiced, polished, carefully curated not to sound antagonistic while still being unmistakably final. Marcus stepped back. He looked around again. No one else was being turned away. No one else being told to wait, to come back, to follow up. The man in denim and the teen in sneakers had just gotten onto the course. He took a breath. He'd been here before. Not this exact place, but in spaces like this. Places where your presence alone was a disruption. Where rules bent like reeds for some and stood rigid like steel bars for others. He nodded once, picked up his wallet, and tucked his ID away. Understood, he said. Thank you for your time. Outside, the wind was cooler. The mist had thinned into a light drizzle, and his reflection warped slightly in the polished glass doors behind him. He walked back toward the lot slowly, passing a new couple just arriving, their bags still zipped, their shoes muddy, their laughter loud. The valet smiled at them, opened their trunk, offered to clean their clubs. No one stopped them. No one asked for confirmation. No one questioned their right to be there. Eventually he stepped out again, this time without his clubs, walking slowly toward the lower lot where the member parking was reserved. He wasn't sure why, but something inside him wouldn't let this moment end there. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was something deeper, a quiet understanding that what had happened wasn't an isolated mistake, but a glimpse into it. He reached the edge of the lot just as an older man in beige pants and a sun visor emerged from his SUV. The man paused, then smiled as he recognized Marcus. "You new around here?" he asked, his tone somewhere between friendly and skeptical. Marcus nodded politely, explaining that he had been invited as a guest that morning. The money's expression changed almost imperceptibly, not into a frown, not into concern, just adjustment. His smile stayed, but his eyes measured. "Funny, don't usually see unfamiliar faces down here," he said, then added with a chuckle. "You must know someone important." Marcus smiled but said nothing. The man kept talking as they walked side by side toward the clubhouse entrance, rambling about tournaments, weather, and politics, with the ease of someone who had never once been questioned at a gate. Inside the lobby, Marcus approached the desk again, not the main one but a smaller side station labeled Member Services. A woman in a navy blazer stood behind it, typing into a silver laptop. Her nameplate read, "Jillian, Guest Coordinator." He explained the situation calmly, asked if someone could recheck the schedule or perhaps contact Carlton. To clarify, Jillian listened politely, nodded occasionally, then gave the kind of smile reserved for people you don't plan to help. "Unfortunately, tea times are handled by reservations management. We can't override anything on the floor level. Best I can do is recommend you email the general office." She slid a printed contact sheet toward him like it was a receipt, already turning her attention back to her screen. Marcus asked if she could at least verify Carlton's check-in status. She didn't look up. "That's not something we typically disclose to guests," she said, voice even. Then, without missing a beat, she added, "Have a great rest of your day, Mr. Bailey." It was clear the conversation was over. She didn't even wait for his response. As he stood there, still holding the paper, she was already greeting the next person, a woman in yoga gear holding a golden retriever on a leash. Marcus stepped back, watching the quiet choreography of a system that had learned how to exclude without ever having to say no. No one yelled. No one cursed. No one said, "You don't belong." They didn't need to. He walked back outside, passing the older man from earlier, now chatting with a groundskeeper about the greens on hole 4. Neither of them looked in Marcus's direction. In the parking lot, a young man with a clipboard was checking tags on the cars. He barely glanced at Marcus before turning back to the Bentley parked next to him. On the drive out, Marcus slowed in front of the tall wrought iron gate, his eyes catching a glimpse of a plaque mounted on the 3. Founded 1911, tradition, integrity, excellence. He read it 3 times before pulling away. At the gas station 10 minutes down the road, he parked again, filled the tank, then sat in the front seat with the door open, letting the breeze wash in. He checked his email one more time. No new messages from Carlton, nothing from the club. He stared at the message thread and considered replying. Then, he didn't. There was no point. His finger hovered over the browser on int. He opened the club's website. Every photo showed smiling faces, champagne flutes, trophies. Not one of those faces looked like his. He looked sharp. Too sharp. The kind of sharp that, in the wrong setting, could cut through comfort. He walked the outer edge of the clubhouse, taking in its sweeping architecture, the stonework engraved with founding names, the flags fluttering in quiet ceremony above. A film crew moved across the far lawn. As Marcus approached, the clipboard man paused, squinting at him. "Sorry, sir, would you mind stepping out of frame? We're capturing some B-roll for our brand campaign." He smiled, but it was thin and expectant. Marcus stepped aside without a word, standing near the steps where the ivy grew. Behind him, the cameras resumed. Behind the lens, Marcus was invisible. He lingered there a while, pretending to scroll through his phone, observing how people moved when they thought you didn't belong to the frame. 2 staffers rushed by with folded napkins and a silver tray. A woman with auburn hair and a branded windbreaker came around the corner, walking briskly with a glass of white wine in one hand and a phone in the other. She barely looked up before bumping into him. The glass tilted. Cool liquid spilled down his sleeve and across his chest, staining the white cotton like a wound spreading outward. She gasped, paused for half a second, then turned away. No apology, no napkin, no gesture, just a mumbled, "Oh God," and the sound of heels moving faster on stone. Marcus blinked once, then looked down at his shirt, blotting it gently with a hat. From across the path, A man in gray coveralls with a trash cart stopped. "You all right, sir?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, just a little wine shower." The worker smiled, pulled a rag from his pocket and offered it. "She didn't even say anything?" Marcus shook his head. "Figures." The man chuckled dryly and walked off toward the dumpster, muttering something about manners being too expensive these days. Marcus stood still for a long moment, rag in hand, trying to decide what was worse, the silence or the choreography of pretending nothing had happened. The camera crew hadn't noticed, or maybe they had and just didn't care. Either way, the lens had already moved on. A few minutes later, he walked to the patio where members were gathering for drinks. It was open seating and he picked a table near the edge, away from the chatter. He ordered an espresso. The server brought it quickly, efficient and polite. No one looked at him directly, but a few glanced over their glasses, their smiles tightening just enough. No words, only a shift in posture, the kind of collective unease that vibrates through the air, like a burial ancestral prop. He took a sip and opened a news app, scanning headlines he didn't absorb. A child laughed somewhere behind him. Someone's tee shot landed on the green. Someone else ordered another round. The world turned, unchanged. He sat with the stain on his shirt, drying under the late light. A subtle badge no one would ever ask about. His inbox remained quiet. No calls, no messages from Carlton, no acknowledgements from the club. The silence wasn't new, but it felt heavier now, because this time, he had proof. Timestamps, photos, receipts, memories with edges sharp enough to reopen things he thought had long since healed. The next morning, he logged into the club's website to confirm that his member guest registration had disappeared from the system entirely. Not rescheduled, not refunded, just removed. No note, no reason, just a blank where his confirmation had been, like he was never meant to be there at all. He stared at the screen longer than he should have, scrolling back through emails and cross-checking transaction numbers. But it was all the same. One entry gone, a small erasure, quiet and complete. He dialed the contact number listed under guest services. It rang 4 times before redirecting to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. He waited 5 minutes, tried a different number, this one for member events, no answer. By the 5th call, a woman finally picked up. She sounded young and distracted. As soon as he said his name and asked about the registration issue, the line went quiet for a moment. Then she said she couldn't find his details. When he asked if she could transfer him to someone with admin access, she told him they were all in a meeting. She promised to call back. It never came. The next day, he drove to the club. This time he wore a dark jacket, subtle slacks, no tie. A professional neutrality. As he approached the front gate, the security guard stepped out from the booth before he even reached the entrance. The man's tone was clipped, but civil. "Sorry, sir, but guest access is currently limited to registered events." Marcus explained that he had a matter to resolve regarding billing and registration. The guard shook his head. "I was told not to allow any non-member walk-ins this week, sir. Club's in audit mode. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the property." Marcus asked if he could speak with anyone in administration. Jillian, Bryce, anyone at all. The guard didn't raise his voice, but the meaning was firm. "I'm going to need you to leave now." The gate remained closed behind him. There was no escalation, no threat. Just another door, sealed without visible locks. Marcus didn't argue. He turned and walked back to his car, under the soft whir of distant sprinklers. He sat behind the wheel and stared at the gate through the windshield, remembering how different it had looked the first time, how those iron bars once symbolized invitation, exclusivity, excellence. Now they just looked like quiet exile. On the drive home, he passed 3 other club places with the same manicured lawns, same flags flapping in practice symmetry. The sameness of them was disorienting. Each one could have been the other. Each one likely had the same script ready, the same polite hands ready to erase. That night, while sitting at his kitchen table beneath the dim tungsten glow of a single pendant light, he received a message, brief unsigned, from someone he recognized as a junior assistant in the events department. The text read, "Off the record, you've been flagged from the top. They told us not to engage. Sorry." He didn't hear this from me. He stared at the screen for several minutes before replying with just one word, "Understood." He knew then it was no longer a misunderstanding. It wasn't a scheduling error, or a system glitch, or a fluke of bureaucracy. It was a deliberate extraction, a quiet disavowal, a coordinated removal without the need for confrontation. You don't need to be told you're no longer welcome when everyone simply agrees not to speak to you. He closed the messaging app and opened his social media account. He drafted a post measured, respectful, and precise. He described the timeline. He mentioned no names, no insults, no threats. He simply shared what happened, that he was invited, then erased, and that no one would tell him why. He ended the post with a question, not a conclusion. What does silence say when the systems behind it refuse to speak? He hit publish. Within the hour, the post began to circulate. Friends, former colleagues, and acquaintances commented. Some expressed support, some asked questions, some shared their own quiet stories of exclusion. But 2 hours later, the post was gone. Not hidden, not reported. Gone. He checked his notifications, nothing. He logged out, then back in. An error message appeared. Your account has been temporarily restricted for violating community guidelines. No specifics, no examples. Just a note and a ticking countdown. Account access will be reviewed in 72 hours. He read it again. It didn't make sense. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't revealed private information. All he had done was speak. He sat back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. The digital world was no different from the physical one. Doors that looked open from the outside could still be locked on the inside. And now even the act of saying, "This happened," had been rewritten into an infraction. He opened his email again, checked the club's site again, refreshed the app again. Still nothing. Still gone. Still erased. He powered off the phone and let the screen go dark, its black surface reflecting a face that looked like his but somehow quieter, more contained, more isolated. The next morning he received a calendar invite for a charity dinner at the downtown hall. One of those cross-industry events where donors, executives, and civic leaders all gathered under soft lights and scripted praise. His name was still on the list. He considered declining. Then he didn't. Instead, he checked the attendee list, scrolled down past the politicians and foundation heads, and saw a familiar name. So they weren't just a country club. It requested access to the transaction logs, a written explanation for the removal of his confirmed reservation, and a clarification on why he had been barred entry without cause. The letter was sent by courier, signature required. It arrived at the club's main office the next morning at 9:47, Ryan Stein, by a receptionist named Trina. By noon, a response arrived, not to Marcus. It was a scanned copy of an internal memo circulated among club leadership, a 3-paragraph statement couched in legal phrasing and institutional distance. The memo stated, in essence, that the club reserved the right to deny access or alter bookings at its discretion, and that any guest interaction deemed disruptive or inconsistent with community expectations could be managed without further justification. He read those words 3 times. Community expectations, not rules, not policies, expectations. The kind of language that bent like smoke, impossible to grasp or define, but capable of suffocating just the same. He asked his lawyer if this was common. The reply was blunt. If you sue, they'll bury it in technicalities. If you speak, they'll outlast you. Marcus didn't reply. He already knew. He had already felt it. That weekend, a column appeared in a local business journal, one often used by executives to control the narrative without the mess of direct confrontation. It featured an interview with Bryce Whitaker, smiling in front of the clubhouse, hands folded like a professor at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The headline read, "Lakemont upholds standards amid surge in guest access requests." The article described the club's growing popularity, its proud tradition, and the new challenges that came with managing public interest. One quote stood out. "We've had instances recently of individuals attempting to impersonate guests or exploit our reservation systems for personal attention. We take these matters seriously to protect our members and our brand." There were no names mentioned. There didn't need to be. Marcus sat in his apartment, reading the piece on a tablet, the reflection of the screen flickering faintly in his eyes. He wasn't shocked. He had seen this strategy before, in boardrooms, in bidding wars, in public acquisitions where silence wasn't enough, so character had to be questioned. By painting the act of seeking answers as deception, the club had rewritten the entire narrative. He wasn't a wronged guest anymore. He was now, by implication, a disruptor, an opportunist, a man who couldn't take a hint. He spent that night reviewing the timeline, every file, every call, every receipt. He documented the entire process, cleanly, without commentary, and saved it across multiple encrypted drives. Not to post, not to fight, but to hold. Just in case he wasn't chasing apologies now. On a Tuesday morning, while driving to a quiet breakfast meeting with a partner from his second venture fund, he turned on the radio out of habit. The station was tuned to a finance and policy segment he rarely paid attention to. What caught his ear wasn't the topic, it was the voice. Familiar, measured. A woman speaking calmly but with layered confidence, recounting a recent incident that had gone largely unnoticed by the mainstream press. She didn't name the club, but the details were unmistakable. A prominent black entrepreneur had been denied access to a private venue despite confirmed credentials, and was subsequently erased from all systems. The voice on air described it not as a mistake, but as a structural reflex, a reflex of exclusion wrapped in professionalism. Then she said his name. Marcus Bailey is not just a name on a reservation list, she said. He's one of the driving forces behind Strategy Capital, a firm with direct investment authority over several high-profile luxury brands, including the ones that sit behind some of this country's most prestigious country clubs. The room fell silent. The host of the program asked a follow-up, clearly caught off guard. The guest didn't offer gossip or outrage. He simply said, "If institutions believe they can erase people who helped build the very structures they profit from, they are in for a surprise. Because Marcus Bailey isn't just a guest, he's the ledger." Marcus sat still in the car for 5 full minutes after the segment ended. He wasn't sure who had arranged that interview or why, but he knew the voice. It belonged to one of the founding partners at Argent Strategies, a firm he'd advised on a major urban reinvestment project 2 years ago. She had always spoken with precision, and today she'd used that gift not as a weapon, but as a signal. A signal that the erasure hadn't gone unnoticed. That someone still remembered, that someone with reach had decided to speak. By noon, the reaction had begun. It started with a press release, careful, corporate, but unmistakably serious. The luxury brand consortium responsible for a sizable portion of Lockmont's vendor relationships announced an internal review. "We are conducting an internal audit of all contracted partnerships and evaluating the alignment of our brand values with those of our affiliates." It didn't name names. It didn't have to. The subtext was clear. The money was watching. Later that afternoon, another domino fell. A corporate newsletter from one of Strategy Capital's portfolio companies, an apparel brand worn by nearly every pro at Lakemont, released a quiet statement reaffirming its commitment to equitable representation and inclusion. No direct link was drawn, but the implication hung in the air like storm clouds gathering behind glass. That evening, Marcus received 3 calls. 2 were from numbers he didn't recognize. One was from a senior partner at a PR agency that had previously ignored him. They all wanted the same thing: to talk, to clarify, to de-escalate. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he reviewed the data again. The files, the timeline, the audio clips. Not because he needed to, but because preparation was the only thing that calmed the storm in his chest. That night, as the city outside his window sank into a quiet blue hush, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Not anger, not relief, but leverage. Not the kind you threaten with, but the kind you carry like armor. The kind that reminds you that even silence can echo when the right people are listening. While Marcus kept his phone quiet and his responses non-committal, the corporations that funded, branded, and underwrote Lockmont began to run calculations that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with risk. By the end of the week, enough leverage had accumulated that a boardroom at the club's parent company, an emergency shareholder meeting, citing brand exposure vulnerabilities and governance irregularities as the reason. The list of invitees was exclusive, concise, and surgical in its design. On that list, in slot 3, below the chair, and one senior partner, was the name Marcus A. Bailey, listed with full voting rights. He arrived exactly on time, wearing a slate gray suit without a tie, carrying only a black portfolio. The room was lined with polished glass and dark walnut paneling, the kind of space where eye contact meant hierarchy and silence could speak louder than reports. A team of attorneys sat at one end, corporate counsel at another, and directly across from them Bryce Whitaker sat from stone. He hadn't seen Marcus since the day he'd turned him away at the gate, and the glance he offered now was cautious, studiously neutral, but the pulse in his jaw betrayed a different energy. Marcus took his seat, nodded once to the chair, and opened his folder without a word. As the meeting opened, routine statements were read into record, market performance was reviewed, growth projections laid out, but then the agenda pivoted to public affairs and liability risk, and the room grew quieter. A senior auditor walked through, a timeline of escalating complaints, flagged incidents, and reputational analytics. None of it mentioned Marcus by name, but the sequence was familiar to anyone in the room paying attention. Then came a short pause, a cue designed into the script. Marcus reached into his folder and pulled out a single envelope, thin, neatly labeled, and placed it directly in front of him. Without looking at anyone, he pushed it forward across the glass toward the center of the table. Inside were 7 formal letters of inquiry he had sent over 6 months, each one asking for clarification, for conversation, for acknowledgement. None of them had been answered. The last one had been time-stamped the day before he was removed from the course. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The document said everything. The silence in the room turned heavy. Bryce adjusted his cuff but said nothing. A lawyer on the left side of the table cleared her throat and leaned forward slightly, as if to speak, but caught herself. The chair looked at the envelope, then at Marcus, then at the others. A motion was introduced, seconded, and passed. The language was elegant but final. Temporary suspension of operational oversight pending compliance review. Bryce was asked to step out. He stood, nodded once, and walked out without comment, but the air behind him felt thinner once he was gone. Marcus remained still. He didn't gloat. He didn't blink. When the meeting adjourned, he gathered his folder, stood slowly, and left the room without shaking a single hand. The hallway outside was quiet, the kind of silence that follows the end of something or the beginning of something else. As he walked down the corridor, his reflection followed in the glass, not larger than life, not triumphant. By the time he reached the elevator, 2 staffers who had once ignored his emails now stood up straighter as he passed. They didn't speak. He didn't stop. The doors opened. He stepped inside and let them close behind him. Behind that sentence was chaos. Within 48 hours of the board meeting, 3 senior managers received official notices of termination. Bryce Whitaker, the guest services director who had shaped the club's image for nearly a decade, Jillian from guest relations, whose name had appeared on 5 unanswered correspondence threads, and the COO of the parent company's leisure division, whose signature authorized the reservation system Marcus had been deleted from. The firings weren't loud. There were no statements, just names removed from staff directories and LinkedIn updates made quietly, without fanfare. The industry took notice. Partner brands began withdrawing co-sponsored events, citing unforeseen alignment concerns. Vendors delayed shipments. A high-profile tournament scheduled for the following quarter was pulled from the club's calendar and relocated without public explanations. Media outlets reached out for comment, but none was given. The story was too delicate, too silent, too corporate for scant. Something had cracked. What once was framed as prestige had now become liability. Membership requests dropped by half in a single week. More telling than that, a cluster of longtime members, the kind whose names were etched into stone at the entrance, submitted formal requests to pause or cancel their memberships. Their letters were polite, vague, and diplomatic, but their intent was unmistakable. "We don't want to be." One letter in particular, submitted by a legacy family with 3 generations of membership, included a handwritten postscript. "This place doesn't feel like it belongs to us anymore, and maybe it never should have." That sentence was passed around quietly in private group chats and forwarded emails, a ripple inside the institution's core. The club had always relied on the illusion of unity, a curated harmony made of shared wealth and quiet tradition, but now that illusion was crumbling, not because of protest, but because of reflection. Members began to question how much they had accepted, how much they had ignored, and whether the club's exclusivity had long since transformed into something uglier. Marcus didn't speak to the press. He didn't make a statement. He went to work like usual, met his teams, reviewed budgets, oversaw funding decisions, and replied to stakeholders who now asked with renewed interest how Stratium planned to approach civic partnerships moving forward. Behind closed doors, his presence had shifted from respected to consequential. People listened differently now, not out of fear but recognition. They understood that silence could no longer protect them, not when power came dressed in patience and moved with precision. Marcus had never wanted to break anything. He simply wanted a place to stand. But in defending that right, he had shown others the fracture lines that had always been there, only now impossible to ignore. The year that followed did not rush toward resolution, but moved instead with the steady rhythm of consequence. The quiet unraveling of Lockmont's identity continued behind closed doors, while the world outside kept turning, boardrooms reorganized, sponsorships realigned, policies rewritten, not out of guilt but necessity. No grand headlines accompanied the transformation. It was not a scandal to be chewed over on morning talk shows, but a shift in gravity, slow. Bryce Whitaker, the man whose voice once defined the boundaries of exclusivity at the club, resurfaced not in luxury press but on public television. He appeared thinner, more restrained, his tailored suits replaced by softer fabrics, his tone unguarded. In a broadcast interview moderated by a civic ethics nonprofit, he spoke not with authority, but with reflection. He admitted his failures, not in policy or oversight, but in vision. "I lived in a world that rewarded selective blindness," he said, "and I stayed blind because it served me." No apology was directed at Marcus by name, but none was needed. The audience knew, the industry knew, most importantly, Bryce knew. The words weren't offered as redemption, but as inventory, an acknowledgement that the house he once curated so carefully had been built on exclusion and protected by silence. It wasn't a performance. It was something more honest, a dismantling of a self he no longer wished to defend. That alone did not absolve him, but it made space for something different. Weeks after that broadcast, he was seen volunteering with an education initiative focused on bias training and structural literacy for young professionals entering legacy industries. He didn't publicize the work. There were no camera crews. But he showed up, regularly, without title, and listened more than he spoke. Marcus, meanwhile, continued on with measured presence. He accepted no awards for what had happened, gave no interviews, made no campaign of it. When asked in a panel months later about the incident at Lakemont, he offered a single sentence: "I wasn't trying to make a point. I just refused to disappear." His answer echoed in the room, because it wasn't crafted, it was lived. At a private forum on justice in enterprise, hosted in a minimalist theater space downtown, Marcus sat on stage alongside civic leaders, executives, and community builders. Among the seated was Bryce, quiet and attentive, invited not as a voice of authority but as a witness to change. No one introduced him. No one needed to. When the forum ended, Marcus walked past him, offered a nod, simple, direct, unsentimental, and Bryce nodded back. The gesture was not forgiveness nor friendship. It was understanding. In the following months, a growing number of institutions began reevaluating their internal codes of conduct, no longer out of fear of exposure, but from genuine acknowledgement of what systemic erasure looked like. Across industries, policy frameworks shifted, language evolved. So did hiring practices, onboarding protocols, and review processes. It wasn't revolution, it was architectural. Marcus never claimed credit for these changes. He didn't need to. The truth had been made visible, and once seen, it could not be unseen. On the anniversary of that forgotten tea time, Marcus returned, not to the club, but to a reclaimed public course downtown, one he had quietly invested in years prior. He played 9 holes alone, no cameras, no applause, just the sound of iron on ball, the rhythm of breath, the steady echo of progress made without spectacle. As he walked the last fairway, wind cutting clean across the city skyline, he paused near a plaque recently installed at the edge of the green. It bore no names, just a line etched in steel. A place belongs to those who refuse to be erased. The end. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful narratives like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story struck you the most? Were there any moments that caught you off guard? Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and how would you have responded if you were in Marcus's shoes? Your voice matters. Let's keep the conversation going.